when I was invited to come to the formidable Oxford Union and speak to you, I learned that I was only the third German ever to receive an invitation for a solo address, which put a little pressure on me because it gets worse. The first one was Albert Einstein, greatest genius of all time. And the second one was one of my big childhood heroes, a man I modeled my life on when I was a kid, and that is Bum Bum Boris Becker. So I'm really grateful and honored and happy to have this occasion to speak to you today. For me, it's actually somewhat of a historic moment. And speaking of history, are there any history students here? Well, I have good news for anyone who is interested in history, because history is an open book. I did not study history, and still I could find something even in the most studied era of history, which is National Socialism and the Second World War, that all the historians had overlooked. And I'm going to talk about that secret or that angle that I, a non-historian, has uncovered. And maybe it will be encouraging to you as well to seek out-of-the-box research methods. My out-of-the-box research method, and I didn't know it at the time, was actually hanging out in Berlin underground techno clubs and speaking with DJs and dealers of illicit substances. So how did this story start? I was 12 years old, about the age of my son who came with me here today, which makes me very happy that he's here. Don't worry, I didn't hang out in underground clubs at 12, but I was speaking at that age to my grandfather, because in the 80s, this was in 1982 approximately, it was a time when we were quite thoroughly educated about National Socialism. There was this sentence in Germany, "This shall never happen again," a sentence that I wholeheartedly subscribe to, which is actually not so present anymore in Germany, unfortunately. But back then, we were really educated about fascism. And at that age, at that young age, I had heard the first news about these horrors that had taken place in my country. I had seen the first images of camps and of trains, especially these iconic trains going east. And I wanted to know from my grandfather, because I knew that he had worked for the German railway. He was an engineer. And I loved my grandfather. I admired him. He taught me a lot of things. But when I learned that during his generation these atrocities have been committed, I wanted to know from him. And I was in the garden of his house, small town in West Germany, beautiful summer day, and I said to him, "What did you see? What did you experience? What did you do?" And at that moment, I could sense that the relationship between us somehow shifted, or something was different, because he had trouble finding the right words. And he cast down his eyes, and he became a bit insecure. And then he told me a story that he had actually seen a train, a specific train, when he was stationed in the east in occupied Czech Republic in the winter. A cattle train had been coming and had stopped there, and he had seen a hand, actually a hand of a child, about my age, about the age of my son, coming through the air slits of that cattle train with a string in the hand, and on the string attached was a cup, and that hand lowered the cup into the snow and then drew it back up. And he told me this story, and I said, so what did you think? What did you do? And he said, well, my first reaction was, this is against regulations of German railway system. You don't put people in cattle trains. What did you do? He said, well, I just continued my work. I was afraid. So that moment was the decisive moment when I became a writer. Also, I was not good enough in tennis, to be honest. I was quite an intense player. I played in a club in my hometown, and I played tournaments, but against Bum Bum Boris, I could sense that this is I'm not gonna change the world through tennis, but I thought maybe I can change something through writing, through reporting. I sense that maybe writing is an anti-fascist activity, maybe even, or at least an activity, the exchange of ideas for which the Oxford Union also stands, that might promote the democratic society and might prevent fascism from ever coming back. 28 years later, I'm standing in my writing tower in Berlin after a very long weekend in the clubs. I had published 3 novels by then, and I was looking for a topic for my next book. And I was with DJ Alex, resident DJ of Club of Visionaries. If you're ever in Berlin and you want to go to Club of Visionaries, I highly recommend it. You can contact me, I'll get you in. And Alex was very animated. That I think it was a Sunday afternoon after parties start in Berlin on Friday and they continue. And he said, you should have to write about Nazis and drugs. And I said, well, that's a great idea, but it would be a very short book because Nazis didn't take any drugs. In fact, this was always, this was actually central to National Socialist ideology, the idea of cleanliness, of removing the toxins out of the German body. Actually, anti-Semitic policies were early on connected to anti-drug policies. The Nazi Party was actually an anti-drug, the first anti-drug government in Europe. So I kind of knew this, and for sure the Nazis didn't take any drugs. So I said, well, this would be, it's a nice idea, maybe I can make something up. And he said, no. Last week, a friend of mine, an antique dealer, has purchased a medicine chest from a bankrupt West Berlin pharmacy, and in that chest were packages labeled Pervitin, which I think is one of the grand brand names of all times, actually. Pervitin. And the only ingredient in Pervitin is methamphetamine. He told me this, and he told me also that the antique dealer took these pills, 60-year-old pills, and he took it himself, being a good German Berlin DJ. And he said after the 3rd pill, and then he pointed at a ship that was going by in the river outside my writing tower. After the 3rd Pervitin pill, 60-year-old methamphetamine pill from Germany, I felt like my engines were being turned on. And I thought this was a crazy story. Maybe there is something to it. Maybe this is a bigger book. And I thought maybe I should write a non-fiction book, because previously I'd only written novels. I had invented everything, but now I was curious, was there actually a wide methamphetamine use in Nazi Germany? What was going on? No one had really published anything about it, and I did what I thought all historians do, go to the archives. But now I've learned that a lot of historians actually just go to the library to read other historians' books and make up their own theories about, or their own books from other books. But the thing that I thought was the thing to do was go to the libraries, and the first thing I did was check out the company that manufactured methamphetamine. That was the Temmler company, and I could see that methamphetamine was quite a big hit in 1938 in Berlin and in other German cities. People didn't drink coffee in the morning to get ready for work. They took a methamphetamine pill. There was even I found records and sales figures and advertisement. There was even a methamphetamine-laced chocolate that was on the market. One piece of chocolate had 9 milligrams of methamphetamine, which apparently is quite a lot. And they were marketed especially for German housewives, fascism being a patriarchal system. Women are supposed to stay at home, clean the house, cook the food, and raise the children. At least with methamphetamine, those chores were more fun, I guess. Rolling Stones would make a song about this a bit, some decades later, Mother's Little Helpers. What my youthful experimentation in the clubs suddenly became methodological expertise, because I understood what methamphetamine means if a whole society, because I had friends who would partake. And I spoke with a historian about this, actually the leading historian on National Socialism in Germany, Hans Mommsen, and he said, well, we historians, we don't know anything about drugs. So that's why historians have never written about it, because maybe they read methamphetamine, but if you have never experienced what that actually means, if there's thousands of people using it, that could actually have an impact, you might not be able to write about that. So the next decisive step was to go into the military archive. And the military archive of Germany is in Freiburg in the south. It's a very big building, because Germans love to document everything and put everything in its place into the archive. So the military archive of Germany is about as big as the whole town of Oxford. But I stayed there long enough to find records that there was actually a comprehensive and quite huge methamphetamine program, and that the German army was the first army in the world that methodically used a very potent stimulant, crystal meth, the most potent drug in the world, in order to do one thing that seemed decisive, and that is combat fatigue. There was like a guy which in the James Bond movies is called Q. There was a guy like that for the German army, a professor that was responsible for inventing gadgets, but also responsible for performance enhancement. And he took the sentence of Napoleon seriously, that the battle is decided in the last 15 minutes. Who's awake in the last 15 minutes, or most able to fight in the last 15 minutes, will win the battle. So the problem in the last 15 minutes is always fatigue. But with methamphetamine, you can actually stay awake. So he did tests before the war started, and he could see on young medical officers that they could stay awake the whole night and be functional. So not only was the whole civilian society of the performance-driven capitalist National Socialist Germany high on meth, but also this now came into the Wehrmacht, the German army. And I could see in the military archives exactly how the distribution of the methamphetamine was being organized. 35 million dosages of methamphetamine were being ordered in the spring of 1940 before Germany attacked the West. And that attack is quite interesting because it was a challenge for Hitler, because High Command said, we cannot win this. This will be like the First World War. British military and La Grande Armée, the French army, which at the time was supposed to be the best army in the world, together, of course, will be stronger than Germany invading. Because if you're an invading force, you need a 3-to-1 advantage in weaponry, in manpower, and Germany just didn't have that. So High Command never wanted to attack, but Hitler was he ordered the attack basically, but there was no plan that would be successful until in February 1940 he had a working breakfast with 3 tank generals. One of them would become quite famous later on, Rommel. You say Rommel probably, the Desert Fox. And I could see in the archive that before he was the desert fox, he was actually the crystal fox, because his division received the most crystal meth. And why was that important? It was important because the strategy of the German army for this attack against the West was what Churchill, who I guess also gave a solo address here, later called the sickle cut. It was going through the Ardennes Mountains, which was like the eye of a needle. It was a narrow mountainous corridor south of Belgium. British and the Western Allies were in the north of Belgium because they thought Germany would attack there, but the whole German military machine moved through that mountainous terrain, and the trick was to not stop this campaign for 3 days and 3 nights, reach France basically before the British and French defenders wake up and realize what's going on. I don't know if you have ever tried to stay awake for 3 days and 3 nights. Berlin DJs might be able to do that, but you need artificial stimulation for that. So the methamphetamine suddenly became very important. That's why such a high number of pills were ordered, 35 million dosages. And just to illustrate what happened then on the ground when Germany attacked on May 10th, 1940, the French also had their drug regulations. In the First World War, they had made very good experiences with red wine, the national drug of France, obviously. So their regulation was each man is allowed to drink 3/4 of a liter of red wine per day. So when Germany attacked, 3,400 trucks filled with red wine moved from the French wine regions to the front lines, distributing their goods. So this is what I call asymmetrical warfare, pharmacological asymmetrical warfare. You can imagine a French guy drinking 3/4 of a liter of Bordeaux, and suddenly the German guy filled with 15 milligrams of crystal meth approaches. This is basically what happened and what made the German advance go so quickly through France, and what completely surprised the Western Allies, and what even completely surprised Hitler himself, because he knew obviously about the strategy, but he didn't know about the methamphetamine part of it. So for him, it was also completely unbelievable how fast the German military was moving. I don't know if you've seen the movie Dunkirk by Nolan, which I think is lacking the German side, because what was going on the German side was very, very interesting. Why did they not close Dunkirk? They could have easily taken Dunkirk, and the British military would have been cut off from the island, and Germany would have won the war already then. But Hitler, being so confused by his own methed up generals, gave out this halt order and had the troops actually stop. That's why Britain was able to evacuate. So if he wouldn't have done that, I probably would not have been only the third German to speak here. So what's going on with Hitler? I became interested in him as well, because he was portrayed by NS ideology as this clean vessel, vegetarian, a teetotaler, not even coffee, only there to be of service to the German people. That was Nazi propaganda, but that kind of was also how Hitler was still seen when I wrote the book. I mean, he was seen as this weird guy who never took anything, had no private life. So I decided to have a closer look, and I went to the Federal Archives of Germany in Koblenz, where the notes of his personal physician were stored. A guy called Theodor Morell, who had been like a VIP doctor in Berlin in the 30s, and had met Hitler in 36 during a spaghetti dinner in Munich, and had become immediately Hitler's personal physician because he had probiotics and he cured Hitler's chronic stomach problems and his bloating. So Hitler had great confidence in this man, and actually spent every day from 36 to 45 with Morell. So Morell was closer to Hitler than anybody else. So looking at Morell's papers in the archives, I thought would be worthwhile. And the interesting thing to me, sitting there in the archives, was that basically no one had ever looked at these papers. Not even, for example, Ian Kershaw, the great biographer of Hitler, who really wrote a formidable biography on Hitler, but he only mentions Morell like 3 times on 1,200 pages, like Morell gave Hitler his weird medications. But in the Federal Archives, these weird medications actually became quite an interesting reality, because Morell meticulously noted what he gave Hitler every day, and it was quite obvious that Hitler became addicted very quickly, not to a specific medicine, but to injections in general. So every day he received an injection that would optimize his performance. So in the beginning, those were mostly vitamins, supplements, we would say today, but in 1941, and especially in 43 and 44, when the war became quite tough for Germany or difficult, he used more and more opioids. He used, his favorite drug was OxyContin, the very opioid that is now responsible for the opioid crisis in the United States. It was a German patent. It was called Eukodal in Germany. And the patent was lost when Germany lost the war. It became an American patent and is now causing what it is causing. So Hitler was not at all a teetotaler, but became a junkie in 43 and especially in 44. He's using 20 milligrams of Eukodal intravenously every second day, which is a very high dosage. I also didn't know. DJ Alex helped me again, because I had read in German it says Eukodal, and I just read in the files he took Eukodal. So I said this to Alex, what is this Eukodal? And he said, are you insane? You don't know what Eukodal is? Because he knew what Eukodal is, and it creates a very strong euphoric making high, especially if you use it intravenously. So when I spoke again with Hans Mommsen, the historian, he said that this actually explains Hitler's drop in performance. He was very good in decision making until a certain point, and that point is when he began using drugs, opioids especially, cocaine also, but cocaine didn't play such a big role. It was mostly the opioid. Removed himself more and more from reality, because reality was not always pleasant in the later years of war for him, because Germany was about to lose. So he was removing himself more and more from reality, not only moving into bunkers made from concrete, but also into bunkers made from chemistry. So I was able in this book Blitzed to give a maybe more precise or a biography that Mommsen, the historian, called the missing piece, that actually explains the performance drop in Hitler, which, for example, led to the British intelligence deciding not to try to assassinate him anymore, because they realized, let's keep this guy in place because his decisions are no longer corresponding with reality, which was catastrophic for the German war effort and good for the world. So in a way, actually, Morell kind of saved the world by ruining Hitler's health, which is not to say that Morell did that on purpose. He basically just tried to react to Hitler's constant desire to be on top of his game and always be able to perform all the things he had to perform at all times, being the sole leader, which is actually quite interesting. Also, I compare in the book the way Churchill formed decisions